Nom, the lawyer's office smelled like old paper and someone's burnt coffee. I sat in the chair closest to the door, not because I planned to leave early, but because that's just what I do. Old habit. Always know your exit. I was still in my scrubs. I'd come straight from a 12-hour shift at the hospital, hadn't even stopped to change. My brother was sitting across the room in a pressed button-down shirt, khakis with an actual crease in them. My sister-in-law had on a blazer. They looked like they were attending a job interview. I looked like I'd been elbow-deep in someone's IV line since 5 in the morning, which I had. My mother sat between us, which felt right. She'd always sat between us. The lawyer, Mr. Holt, gray at the temples, reading glasses on a chain, opened a folder and started talking. I watched the ceiling fan turn. One of the blades had a small crack in it. I kept waiting for it to fly off. Dad had passed 6 weeks earlier. Pancreatic cancer. Fast. 3 months from diagnosis to gone, and I'd taken as much leave as I could get from the hospital, which wasn't enough, and driven 4 hours every weekend for the last 2 months of his life to sit with him. My brother lived 40 minutes away and came twice. I'm not saying that to be bitter. I'm saying it because it's what happened. Mr. Holt cleared his throat. He read through the standard language. Being of sound mind, all debts and taxes, etc. Then he got to the part we were all there for. My brother received the house. The one I grew up in. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, the oak tree in the backyard that Dad and I planted when I was 7. Market value around $340,000. My sister-in-law made a sound that wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a smile. Something in between. To me, Dad left a piece of land. 48 acres in rural eastern Tennessee. No house on it. A storage barn, according to the deed. Some kind of old well. That was it. My brother turned to look at me. He had this expression on his face that I can only describe as satisfied. Like he'd won something, and winning required that I lose. Well, he said, I guess that makes sense. I looked at him. I mean, you're always out in the middle of nowhere anyway, right? Camping, hiking, all that. He waved his hand like he was shooing a fly. A field fits you. You've never exactly been the type for anything nicer. My sister-in-law laughed. It was a small laugh, the kind that's meant to sound polite but isn't. My mother looked at the table. I didn't say anything. There's a thing they teach you in nursing. Not officially, not in any textbook, but you learn it fast. When a patient is being cruel because they're scared, you don't take it personally. You just breathe and you keep your hands steady. I breathed. I kept my hands steady. I breathed. I kept my hands steady. Mr. Breath. Holt finished up the paperwork. I signed what needed signing. My brother shook the lawyer's hand like they were old friends. When we got out to the parking lot, he clapped me on the shoulder. Hey, look on the bright side, he said. No property taxes on an empty field, right? He laughed at his own joke. My sister-in-law was already on her phone. I got in my car and drove to the gas station on the corner and sat in the parking lot for about 10 minutes. Then I pulled up the address on the deed and started driving. I'd heard Dad mention the land before, but only in passing. He'd inherited it from his own father, my grandfather, who'd bought it sometime in the 60s for almost nothing. Dad used to talk about taking me there someday, back when I was a kid. We'll camp out there, he'd say. Just us. We never went. Life got in the way it does, and then he got sick, and then he was gone. The drive out took about 90 minutes. I left the interstate and followed 2-lane roads that got narrower and quieter the farther I went, until I was on a gravel road with trees pressing in on both sides and a hand-painted mailbox with a number that matched the deed. I pulled over and just sat there for a second. The land opened up past a rusted gate, not locked, just shut. Rolling hills, mostly wooded, with a wide meadow in the middle that the late afternoon sun was hitting at exactly the right angle. The storage barn was older than I'd expected, wood gone gray, but the bones looked solid. There was a pond I hadn't known about, small and still, with cattails growing along one edge. I got out of the car and walked to the middle of the meadow and stood there. The wind moved through the grass. A red-tailed hawk was circling something far off. It was completely totally quiet except for the kind of sounds that don't count as noise. Birds, wind, water somewhere. I thought about my brother in his pressed khakis, laughing in the parking lot. A field fits you. I looked out at 48 acres of land in every direction. Yeah, I thought, I think it does. I drove home that night and looked up everything I could find about the property. Tax records, survey maps, county zoning. I'm a nurse. I know how to research. You don't survive a 12-hour ICU shift without knowing how to find information fast and understand what it means. What I found surprised me. The land was in an area that had been quietly attracting attention for the last few years. A regional trail system was being developed nearby. A conservation easement program was offering payments to landowners who agreed to keep their acreage undeveloped. Agricultural leasing for hay production. Timber rights on the wooded portions. And there was something else. I called a friend of mine we'd gone to nursing school together, and she'd gone on to get a second degree in environmental science. Ended up working for a land trust nonprofit. I sent her the parcel number and the survey map. She called me back in 40 minutes. Where did you say this was again? I told her. Do you know what's under it? I didn't. She explained it slowly, the way she does when she's making sure I actually understand and not just nodding. There is a natural spring on the property, fed by an underground aquifer. A clean water source documented that the county had been trying to access for years for a public recreation project. The land trust she worked for had been looking for a willing seller or conservation partner in exactly that area for 18 months. Lily, she said, that's my name, Lily. This land is not nothing. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. I didn't tell my brother. I didn't tell my mother. I called a real estate attorney in the county where the land was located, explained the situation, asked her to walk me through my options. Her name was Ms. Reeves, and she had the kind of voice that made you feel like things were going to be handled correctly. I had the deed. The land was mine, clean and clear, no liens, no disputes. I owned it. I also, this part matters, started going back out there. Not to do anything in particular. Just to be there. I took days off I'd been hoarding for 2 years and drove out and walked the perimeter. I found the spring my friend had mentioned, tucked in a low spot near the eastern tree line, water so clear you could see the rocks at the bottom. I found an old fence line that marked where my grandfather had once tried to run cattle. Post, still standing, wire long gone. I found a flat stone near the pond with my grandfather's initials scratched into it, and next to them, smaller, my father's. I sat down on that stone and cried in a way I hadn't let myself since the funeral, the ugly kind of crying. The kind you can only do when there's no one around. After a while I washed my face in the spring and walked back to my car. About 2 months after the will reading, my brother called. He'd been doing research of his own, apparently. Or someone had done it for him. Hey, so I've been looking into that land Dad left you, he said. Like we were just catching up. Like the parking lot thing hadn't happened. Okay, I said. I think there might have been a mistake in the will. Like a clerical thing. Dad probably meant to divide the land and the house more equitably. He said equitably like he'd recently learned the word. There was no mistake, I said. I was there when Mr. Holt read it. Right, but... He paused. I could hear him regrouping. Look, I'm not trying to make this a thing. I just think, as a family, we should talk about what's fair. You have 48 acres of land. I have a house. That doesn't seem balanced. I thought about the parking lot. A field fits you. The laugh. You said it made sense, I said. You said a field fits me. You said I've never been the type for anything nicer. Silence. That was just a stupid thing I said, okay? I didn't mean anything by it. I know, I said. Because I did know. He meant exactly what he said, and now he'd done his research and he meant something different. And both of those things were true at the same time. So can we talk? There's nothing to talk about, I said. The deed is in my name. The land is mine. If you have concerns about the will, you're welcome to contest it through the appropriate legal channels. But I'd suggest talking to a lawyer before you do that because there's no error, and contesting it would cost you more than it would get you. He started to say something. I said I had to get back to work, which was true. I hung up. 3 weeks later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a man who introduced himself as a representative of a regional land development company. He said he'd heard the parcel had recently changed hands and wanted to know if I'd be interested in selling. He named a figure. I wrote it down. I thanked him for calling. I said I'd be in touch. Then I called my friend at the land trust and Ms. Reeves and spent 2 evenings on the phone understanding exactly what I had and what the options were. The development company's offer was real money. Serious money. More than I'd made in the last 4 years of nursing combined. But I'd also talked to the land trust about the conservation easement, about the spring access partnership with the county, about what the land could become if someone actually chose to do something with it instead of just selling it off to be cleared and subdivided. Dad used to say, not often, but sometimes when he was being that particular version of himself that came out on long drives and quiet evenings, he used to say that the things worth keeping are rarely the things that look like prizes at first. I thought about the stone with his initials on it. My grandfather's next to his. That flat gray rock in the shade of a hickory tree next to a spring that had been running clean for longer than anyone in my family had been alive. I thought about what it would mean to let someone pave over that. I called the development company back and told them I wasn't interested in selling. I didn't make that decision perfectly or cleanly or without second-guessing myself at 3 in the morning more times than I'd like to admit. 48 acres of land in rural Tennessee doesn't pay my rent. The conservation easement partnership would bring in some income, and the hay lease on the meadow would add a little more. But I was not suddenly rich. I was still working my shifts, still eating lunch at my desk. But I drove out there the weekend after I turned down the offer. It was early November, and the leaves had gone gold and rust, and that particular shade of orange that only happens for about 2 weeks a year before everything goes bare. I walked out to the stone and sat on it and looked at the pond. A great blue heron was standing at the edge of the water, absolutely still, looking at something beneath the surface. I watched it for a long time. It didn't catch anything while I was watching. It didn't seem bothered by that. I thought about my brother and the house with the oak tree, with the crease in his khakis. I wondered if he was happy. I genuinely didn't know. I'd spent so many years reading his moods, calculating around them, that I'd never really stopped to wonder whether the person I was navigating around was actually okay. I didn't have an answer. Maybe that wasn't mine to know anymore. My mother had called once since the conversation with my brother. She'd said she hoped we could all get along. I'd told her I hoped so too. Neither of us had said anything that felt true exactly, but neither of us had said anything false either. We were still figuring out what the shape of things was going to be going forward. I think we both knew it wasn't going to look like it used to. That's a loss. I want to be honest about that. The version of family I'd carried around in my head, the one where we'd eventually reach some kind of ease with each other, where the history would soften, that version was gone. I was grieving that at the same time I was grieving my father, and the two griefs kept getting tangled up together in ways that were hard to sort out. But I was here, sitting on my grandfather's stone, on my father's land, which was now my land. The heron was still standing at the edge of the water. The spring was still running. The hickory tree over my head still had a few leaves left, yellow and trembling. A field fits you. Maybe it does, I thought. Maybe that's not the insult he thought it was. I've been back out about a dozen times since then. I fixed the gate, got a proper latch, not a lock, because I don't want the neighbors to feel unwelcome. And from what I can tell, the people on the adjacent property are decent and have been quietly keeping an eye on the land for years out of respect for my grandfather's memory. I had a conversation with the county parks department about the spring access project. They were straightforward and fair about it. Ms. Reeves helped me understand the paperwork. I'm not building a house out there. Not yet anyway, maybe someday. Right now it's just land. Mine to walk on, mine to think on, mine to decide about on my own timeline. My friend asked me recently if I ever regretted not taking the development offer. I thought about it honestly. No, I said. She asked why not. I said. She asked why not. I tried to explain it. The stone. The heron. The way the spring sounds in November when everything else has gone quiet. The initials scratched by my grandfather's hand in the 1960s and my father's hand sometime after that, and mine now too. I carved them next to his last month. Small, just there. She said that sounded like enough of a reason. I think it is. I think sometimes the things that look like consolation prizes turn out to be the actual prize. I think sometimes the people who think they're handing you the short end of the stick are wrong about what the stick is worth. And I think my father knew all of that, and he left me exactly what he meant to leave me. Not because I needed land, but because he knew I was the one who would actually go there and stand in the meadow and let the wind do what wind does and understand what it meant to belong to something. My brother got the house, I got the rest. I've thought a lot about what my brother said in that parking lot, not because it still hurts. It doesn't, not the way it used to. But because I want to understand how a person gets there. How you stand next to someone who just lost her father. Someone who drove 4 hours every weekend for 2 months to sit with a dying man while you stayed home, and you laugh. How you look at what she's been given and turn it into a punchline. I think I understand it now, and it's not complicated. He saw something he didn't recognize as valuable, so he assumed it wasn't. That's not cruelty exactly. It's just a failure of imagination. The problem is that a failure of imagination, when it's aimed at another person, lands exactly like cruelty. It feels the same on the receiving end. What I keep coming back to is this. The way he dismissed that land was the same way he'd always dismissed me. Quietly, consistently, in small ways that were easy to explain away individually. She's always been the outdoorsy one. She doesn't care about things like this. She's fine. And because I was fine. Because I kept being fine, kept showing up, kept doing the work, it never cost him anything to keep dismissing me. That's how it works, I think. People treat you the way you allow them to, not out of calculated strategy, but out of habit, out of the comfort of things staying the same. The land changed that. Not because of what it's worth, though it turned out to be worth more than either of us understood that day in Mr. Holt's office. It changed things because I stopped waiting for my brother's version of me to be wrong. I just went and stood in the meadow and knew it myself. That's a different thing. That's not proving anything to anyone. That's just knowing. I think about the initials on that stone a lot. My grandfather's hand sometime in the 60s, my father's years later. Mine, now. 3 people who belong to the same piece of ground, who understood something about staying and tending and patience that my brother in his pressed khakis in the house with the oak tree may or may not ever learn. I'm not saying that to be unkind. I genuinely hope he learns it, but I'm not waiting around anymore to see if he does. The hardest thing I did in this whole story wasn't turning down the development offer, though that was hard. It wasn't the phone call where I told my brother there was nothing to discuss. It was the drive out there the first time. Still in my scrubs, not knowing what I'd find, not knowing if I'd feel anything at all or just stand in a field and feel cheated. That drive required something from me that I can only call nerve. The willingness to go towards something uncertain and let it be whatever it was, without deciding in advance what it meant. It turned out to mean everything. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this, if they're in a place where someone has handed them the short end and laughed while doing it. You don't have to convince them they were wrong. You don't have to wait for the apology or the moment they finally see the value in what they dismissed. You just have to go to the field, stand in the meadow. Let the wind do what wind does. The rest has a way of working itself out.